Okay, here in this demonstration, we're going to demonstrate the GluAPI. So those of you who are using Gluware, you have your system, you're signed into it. When you navigate in, you then have your user profile. You can look at the organizations and you navigate into applications like Device Manager, and you discover your devices or run network searches, or you navigate into Audit, which we're going to be highlighting in another demonstration, and you're interacting with the product through the user interface. What we're going to introduce in this demonstration is how to use the GluAPI and highlight for you how you can exercise some of the new features and capabilities introduced in Gluware 4.2. So the first step in working with the GluAPI is turning it on. So you go into settings and you go into your organization settings, and under organizations you have to ensure that the GluAPI is enabled by clicking this box and then determining your authentication method. In this case, I'm managing my users directly through Gluware and the integrated role-based access control. So that is there. I want to check this, determine how I'm authenticating, and then make sure you click the Save button. By doing that, you're spinning up the capabilities in Gluware on the back end to turn on the API endpoint services. Without that turned on, Gluware is not going to be listening and responding to any API request. So that's part one. Part two is to understand where the Gluware API documentation is located, and it is integrated with your instance. So all you have to do is use your instance IP, and then after your system name or address, you type API-docs, close your slash, and it loads the API documentation as you see here. And then if you're just getting used to using APIs, you're basically working with things like gets and posts type commands. A lot of where you're collecting information, you're using commands like gets to get information out of Gluware, and with posts you're pushing information into your Gluware instance. But you can scroll through the documentation and get an understanding of the API calls and the parameters and example output and other queries and things you can use. Like this one, if you execute this call on your system, a get, and you're specifying the devices, and you potentially use the query for your particular organization, you will pull those devices in. So with that introduction being said, the way we're going to execute and look at Gluware is using one main external tool and one additional piece of software that I find very complementary when using or exercising an API. So let me minimize the Gluware UI, and now I'm going to show you this software that I've played with a few of them. This is just a personal preference or recommendation, is something called the ARC client, the Advanced REST client, or ARC for short. It was supported by or provided by MuleSoft, which I believe was acquired by Google. So with a product like this, as a non-programmer, or if you're not a DevOps guy, but you want to understand how the APIs work and test the APIs, and then maybe pass them on to a programming resource that's going to integrate these APIs with your programmatic resource, what they're going to ask you is, well, what calls do you want me to make, and what are the requirements to programmatically integrate this solution? So let's take a look at that. So just a couple example calls to just demonstrate this, and we'll leave you towards learning and continuing on your education about how to use it. But let's take a look at this. One of the first calls you need to do with Gluware is, as you saw in the UI, Gluware is multi-user as well as it's multi-tenant. We call those tenants organizations. One of the first things you want to execute is you want to use the get to pull the organizations, and we are using basic authentication. So I'm passing the user credentials. These user credentials are passed with each API call. They authenticate the session and then enable you with the same role-based access control as assigned in the system to this user. So let's take this call and send it to the Gluware system, which again, this is my Gluware instance. and I'm leveraging that API endpoint, and I'm going to send it. So with sending that API call, I get the response from my Gluware system in this JSON structure. So there's some important parameters here, and it's showing me I have the Gluware demo org and the parent org, which is the Gluware system org, which is always there by default unless you delete it. So the main organization I'm working with in this demonstration is called the Gluware demo org. And there's a parameter I need for subsequent calls, which is this ID. So if I was working with this programmatically, I would be storing this value. When I'm working it here more ad hoc with understanding how to exercise and demonstrate the API calls, I need to store those variables. So what I will suggest to you as a user of this product, I suggest you also have some sort of notepad. I find Notepad++ very handy because you can tell it the language is JSON, and then it will kind of put the output into much more readable components. But what I do while exercising the GluAPI is I take the output that I'm capturing the orgs, and I create a little note called organizations, and this is the org I'm working with. So in a subsequent call, if I need a variable, I can just come here and grab it on a more easy basis. This is just a personal preference or recommendation for how to work with or exercise the API a little better. So let's move on to the next call. You kind of want to work logically in order here. You want to get the organizations. Then another one to a good call to understand and get is your device list. So now I'm pulling the Gluware system and pulling for the devices, but I'm including a query. Whoops. Let me bring that back. I'm including a query for the devices in the org. I hope I didn't mess up this call. Let's see here. Let me clear the output of this response. I'm querying for the devices that have the org ID equal to this value. So if you remember, I already pulled the org. Here's the ID. It ends in C3F92. I can see C3F92. And so now I'm going to query the Gluware system and pull the devices. So let's send that request, communicating with the Gluware system, again, passing the same credentials. And I can see here I get the JSON structure that returns back all of the devices in the details. So I have that full JSON structure. And again, what I often do is just copy and paste the output into a file that I could refer back to. So if I want to go pull, something related to this very specific 3650 switch, likely I will need its internal Gluware ID. Gluware is storing all this information in the internal databases, and we allocate these IDs to keep track of these JSON data models. So moving on kind of more into the use cases associated with Gluware 4.2. 4.2 is expanding a lot of things you can do with the API around executing audits and policies and things like that. So let's take a look at something more audit related, which is this call is saying, get me the audit policies in the system. And let me go ahead and run that call. And I get my response. And it returns back for me the policies that are available. So if I were to look inside Gluware, which I can navigate and show you, let me do that right now. Let's go back to this instance. And if I navigate into audit, I see all of these policies are available. Well, if I want to run these programmatically, meaning trigger them programmatically or look at results programmatically, I need to know what audit policies are there. So I can see these lists of audit policies. By pulling it through the API call, I can pull in that same information with other metadata, like the created on and created by, the ID, which again is important to run it again. But here you can see the DoD STIG for Cisco, iOS, iOS XE, and you get some various information about that as well. And you can scroll down through this information. So now you have your audits. Okay, so one quick last final demonstration here around, I've pulled the policies that are available. Now I want to pull information about policies that were executed. So what I can do is, let me look at. I'm going to run a command to get the results or pull the executions, and I'm going to include in the query my organizational ID. Again, I'm saying what executions have run specifically in this org, and I can run that query. If I clear the response here, I can rerun this query here. I'll give it a second for the UI to catch up. Let's try that again. Let's clear the response. Okay. Now let's go ahead and send this query for the specific organization. And I got a response okay, and it should update with the data that it's pulled over that API. And here we go. We get the JSON structure back, and I can see that the various audit runs to completion are in here. And if I scroll down, I can see when it was run and the status of each execution, and you get that detail. So don't want to get too deep in this demo, just want to give you an introduction to how you can turn on the Gluware API endpoint, how you can use a product like Arc here to exercise that endpoint, and how recommend that you save out your variables or understand how you're working with it. Because even as a network engineer, as you may be passing this off to an integration or DevOps engineer to integrate it programmatically, they're going to be asking you a lot of information like what API calls you want me to onboard, what variables do I need to manage, and what data are you looking at getting out of this? Like I talked about use cases before, but if you're synchronizing inventory or in a separate product, if you're triggering drifts or audits or config changes, you're going to want to know and understand how to leverage those API calls. So this concludes the demo on the Gluware API.